Ukraine, a nation whose history is written in the blood of countless battles for independence and survival. For centuries, this land has stood at the crossroads of empires, fighting again and again for the right to exist as a free people. To understand why Ukraine and Russia have been in conflict for so long, we must journey back through centuries of struggle, domination, and resistance. The story begins long before Russia, as we know it today, even existed. The medieval state of Kyivan Rus, centered in what is now Ukraine's capital Kyiv, was the birthplace of East Slavic civilization. Founded in the 9th century, Kyivan Rus was a powerful and cultured state that adopted Christianity from Byzantium in 988. This was not a Russian state. It was centered in Kyiv, and its legacy belongs to Ukrainian history just as much, if not more, than to Russian history. Kyivan Rus flourished for centuries, but in the 13th century, disaster struck. The Mongol invasions devastated the entire region. Kyiv was sacked in 1240, and the old order collapsed. In the aftermath, the lands of what is now Ukraine and Russia went in different directions. The northern territories around Moscow began developing under Mongol overlordship, eventually becoming the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Meanwhile, Ukrainian lands came under the influence of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This divergence is crucial to understanding the distinct identities that developed. While Muscovy developed as an autocratic state under Mongol influence, Ukrainian lands experienced different political systems, including periods under more decentralized feudal arrangements and later under Polish rule. The Ukrainian Cossacks emerged during this period, free warriors who valued liberty and self-governance. They established their own semi-autonomous communities, particularly in the Zaporizhian Sich, a democratic military organization that became a symbol of Ukrainian independence. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Ukrainian Cossacks were fighting on multiple fronts. They battled the Ottoman Empire and its Crimean Tatar vassals, who regularly raided Ukrainian lands for slaves. They fought against Polish nobles who sought to control them and convert them to Catholicism. And they increasingly came into conflict with the growing power of Muscovy, which was expanding and claiming to be the heir of Kyivan Rus. The critical turning point came in 1648 when Bohdan Khmelnytsky led a massive Cossack uprising against Polish rule. The Khmelnytsky uprising initially succeeded, creating an autonomous Cossack state. But Khmelnytsky needed allies. In 1654, he made a fateful decision, signing the Treaty of Pereyaslav with Muscovy, seeking military protection against Poland. This treaty remains one of the most controversial moments in Ukrainian history. The Treaty of Pereyaslav was supposed to be an alliance between equals, guaranteeing Cossack autonomy. But Moscow interpreted it very differently, seeing it as Ukraine's submission to Russian rule. Over the following decades, Moscow systematically eroded Ukrainian autonomy. The Cossack state's freedoms were progressively restricted. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Promises of protection and partnership followed by domination and control. In the 18th century, the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great completed the destruction of Ukrainian autonomy. In 1775, Russian forces destroyed the Zaporizhian Sich, the heart of Cossack freedom. Ukrainian Cossack leaders were exiled to Siberia or executed. The Russian Empire banned the Ukrainian language in schools and publications. Ukrainian culture was systematically suppressed. The message was clear: Ukraine was not a separate nation. It was Little Russia, a province of the Great Russian Empire. But you cannot kill a nation's spirit through decrees and repression. Throughout the 19th century, Ukrainian national consciousness grew stronger, not weaker. Ukrainian writers, poets, and intellectuals like Taras Shevchenko kept the language and culture alive. Shevchenko, himself born a serf, became the symbol of Ukrainian resistance through his poetry, which called for freedom and dignity. For his writings, he was arrested and sent into exile by Russian authorities. His work remains the foundation of modern Ukrainian identity. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 during World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, Ukrainians saw their chance. In 1918, Ukraine declared independence, establishing the Ukrainian People's Republic. For a brief moment, it seemed Ukraine would finally be free. But independence was not to be. Ukraine became a battleground in the Russian Civil War. The Bolshevik Red Army invaded from the east. Polish forces invaded from the west. White Russian armies fought to restore the old empire. Anarchist forces added to the chaos. Ukraine was torn apart. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had won. Ukraine was forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union. The promise was that Ukraine would be an equal Soviet republic with cultural autonomy. Initially, there was even a policy of Ukrainization, promoting Ukrainian language and culture. But this did not last. Under Joseph Stalin, the policy reversed dramatically. What followed was one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. The Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932 to 1933. Stalin's regime confiscated grain and food from Ukrainian villages to fund rapid industrialization and to crush Ukrainian nationalism. Soviet authorities sealed Ukraine's borders, preventing starving people from seeking food elsewhere. Millions of Ukrainians died of starvation. Estimates range from 3 to 7 million dead. Entire villages were wiped out. This was not a natural famine. It was a deliberate act of genocide designed to break Ukrainian resistance to Soviet rule. The Holodomor left deep scars on Ukrainian national consciousness. It demonstrated that Moscow was willing to use any means, including mass starvation, to maintain control over Ukraine. The trauma of the Holodomor continues to shape Ukrainian identity and explains much of the deep distrust many Ukrainians feel toward Russia. Stalin's terror did not end with the famine. The Great Purge of the late 1930s targeted Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, artists, and political leaders. Anyone who might promote Ukrainian national identity was arrested, executed, or sent to the Gulag labor camps. The Ukrainian language was again suppressed in favor of Russian. Ukrainian history was rewritten to emphasize unity with Russia and downplay Ukrainian distinctiveness. World War II brought new horrors. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ukraine became a major battlefield. Some Ukrainians initially hoped the Germans might be liberators from Soviet oppression. They were quickly disillusioned. Nazi occupation was brutal, with millions of Ukrainian civilians killed, including the entire Jewish population of many towns and cities murdered in the Holocaust. The city of Kyiv witnessed the massacre at Babi Yar, where over 30,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. Ukraine was devastated by the war. Millions died fighting in the Soviet Red Army. Cities were destroyed. When the Soviets returned, they brought renewed repression. Ukrainian nationalist partisans, some of whom had fought both Nazis and Soviets, continued resistance into the 1950s. They were eventually crushed. The Soviet narrative allowed no room for Ukrainian national identity separate from the broader Soviet and Russian identity. Throughout the Cold War, Ukraine remained firmly under Soviet control. The Soviet government promoted the idea that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians were all one people, branches of a common East Slavic tree, with Russia as the trunk. Ukrainian language and culture were tolerated only as folklore, not as a living, modern national identity. Russian was the language of power, education, and opportunity. To succeed in the Soviet system, Ukrainians often had to abandon their language and culture. Despite this pressure, Ukrainian identity persisted. Dissidents continued to fight for human rights and national recognition. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, banned by Stalin, survived underground. In the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of Ukrainian intellectuals challenged Soviet narratives. They were imprisoned, sent to psychiatric hospitals, or exiled, but they kept the flame alive. When the Soviet Union began to crumble in the late 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev policies of glasnost and perestroika, Ukrainians seized the opportunity. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, which the Soviet government initially tried to cover up, demonstrated Moscow's disregard for Ukrainian lives and accelerated demands for independence. Pro-independence movements grew rapidly. In August 1991, after a failed coup in Moscow, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. In December 1991, over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence in a referendum. Ukraine was finally free. The newly independent Ukraine faced enormous challenges. The economy was in shambles. Soviet-era institutions had to be rebuilt as Ukrainian ones. The country had to define its identity and chart its own course. And from the very beginning, Russia struggled to accept Ukrainian independence. Many in the Russian political elite saw Ukraine's independence as temporary, an unfortunate accident of Soviet collapse that would eventually be corrected. They could not accept that Ukrainians might genuinely want to be a separate nation rather than part of a Russian-led union. This attitude has shaped Russian policy toward Ukraine ever since. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine oscillated between pro-Russian and pro-Western political orientations. Some Ukrainian leaders sought close ties with Russia. Others looked toward Europe and the West. This tension came to a head in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, when a pro-Russian candidate appeared to win the presidency through fraud. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets in peaceful protest. The election was rerun, and the pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko won. It was a triumph for democracy and Ukrainian sovereignty. But Russia did not accept this outcome. During the Orange Revolution, evidence emerged that Yushchenko had been poisoned with dioxin, severely damaging his health and appearance. Many suspected Russian intelligence services. The message was clear. Ukraine's orientation was not Ukraine's choice alone. The next years saw continued tension. Russia used energy supplies, particularly natural gas, as a weapon, cutting off supplies during winter to pressure Ukraine politically. Russian media launched propaganda campaigns portraying Ukraine as a failed state and Ukrainian national identity as artificial. In Russian state television, Ukraine was depicted as being run by fascists and extremists, sowing the seeds for future conflict. In 2010, a pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, won the presidency. Initially, it seemed relations with Russia would improve, but Yanukovych proved corrupt and autocratic. In 2013, after promising to sign an association agreement with the European Union that would bring Ukraine closer to Europe, Yanukovych suddenly reversed course under Russian pressure. Instead of signing the EU agreement, he accepted a Russian aid package. This betrayal sparked massive protests in Kyiv known as the Euromaidan Revolution. Students and activists gathered in Independence Square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, demanding that Ukraine move forward with European integration. Yanukovych's government responded with violence. Riot police beat protesters. The protests grew. More and more Ukrainians joined, not just about Europe, but about dignity, freedom, and the right to choose their own future. In February 2014, the situation escalated dramatically. Government snipers fired on protesters, killing over 100 people in what became known as the Heavenly Hundred. But instead of crushing the protest, this massacre unified the country against Yanukovych. He fled to Russia. Ukraine had chosen Europe and democracy over Russian authoritarianism. Russia's response was swift and aggressive. Within days, unmarked soldiers, later confirmed to be Russian special forces, seized government buildings in Crimea, a peninsula that was part of Ukraine but had a Russian military base. In a sham referendum held at gunpoint, Crimea was annexed by Russia in March 2014. It was the first time since World War II that a European country had forcibly annexed territory from another. Simultaneously, Russia fomented armed separatist movements in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Russian intelligence services, military equipment, and troops, disguised as local volunteers, created separatist republics. What Russia called a civil war was actually a Russian invasion. Russian tanks, artillery, and air defense systems poured across the border. Russian regular army units fought Ukrainian forces. One of the war's most tragic moments came in July 2014 when Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a Russian-supplied Buk missile system, killing all 298 people aboard. International investigations confirmed Russian responsibility, but Russia denied involvement and spread disinformation. The war in Donbas killed over 14,000 people between 2014 and 2022. Despite ceasefires and peace agreements like the Minsk Accords, the fighting never truly stopped. Russia maintained its troops and proxies in eastern Ukraine, creating frozen conflict zones that prevented Ukraine from fully controlling its territory or moving forward with Euro-Atlantic integration. Throughout this period, Russia continued its information warfare against Ukraine. Russian media spread narratives that Ukraine was run by Nazis, that Ukrainian identity was artificial, that Russian-speaking Ukrainians were being oppressed. These narratives were designed to justify aggression and undermine Ukrainian statehood. They portrayed Russia not as an aggressor, but as a protector of Russian speakers and defender against Western expansion. In reality, Ukraine was building a democratic, pluralistic society. Elections were free and fair. Media was diverse and free. Civil society flourished. The Ukrainian language and culture, suppressed for so long, experienced a renaissance. But Ukraine also respected minority rights, including for Russian speakers. The narrative of oppression was a fabrication designed to justify intervention. On February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces attacked from multiple directions, from Belarus in the north toward Kyiv, from Russia in the east, and from occupied Crimea in the south. The invasion involved hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and massive artillery and air power. It was the largest military operation in Europe since World War II. Russian leaders, particularly Vladimir Putin, expected a quick victory. They believed Ukrainian resistance would collapse within days. Russian paratroopers attempted to seize Kyiv's airport to fly in troops and capture the capital. Russian columns advanced toward major cities. The plan was to decapitate the Ukrainian government, install a puppet regime, and force Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of control. But Russia miscalculated catastrophically. Ukrainians did not welcome Russian troops as liberators. They fought back with extraordinary courage and determination. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky offered evacuation by Western allies, refused, saying he needed ammunition, not a ride. His decision to stay in Kyiv rallied the nation and inspired the world. Ukrainian forces stopped the Russian advance on Kyiv. The attempted airborne assault on Hostomel Airport failed. Russian columns were ambushed and destroyed. The much-feared Russian military proved far less capable than expected, plagued by poor logistics, low morale, and corruption. By early April 2022, Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine, their attempt to capture Kyiv a complete failure. But the war was far from over. Russia shifted its focus to eastern and southern Ukraine, attempting to seize the Donbas region and create a land bridge to Crimea. The fighting became a brutal war of attrition. Russian forces used massive artillery barges to destroy Ukrainian cities. Mariupol was besieged for months and reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians died. Millions of Ukrainians became refugees, fleeing to other parts of Ukraine or to neighboring countries. Russian forces committed widespread atrocities. In Bucha, a suburb of Kyiv, evidence emerged of mass killings, torture, and sexual violence against civilians. Similar atrocities occurred in other occupied areas. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic violations of international humanitarian law. International organizations documented evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Despite Russia's vast superiority in numbers and firepower, Ukraine has continued to resist. Western countries provided military aid, including advanced weapon systems. Ukrainian forces conducted successful counteroffensives, liberating significant territories in Kharkiv region in September 2022 and Kherson in November 2022. Ukrainian drones struck targets deep inside Russia, including in Moscow. Ukrainian forces destroyed much of Russia's Black Sea fleet, despite Ukraine having virtually no navy. The war continues as of now in early 2025. Ukraine fights not just for territory, but for its very existence as a sovereign nation. Russia's goal, repeatedly stated by its leaders, is to deny Ukraine's right to exist as an independent state separate from Russia. Putin has claimed that Ukraine is not a real nation, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Ukrainian independence is an artificial creation of Western enemies. This brings us to the core of why Ukraine and Russia have been in conflict for so long. It is not really about security concerns or NATO expansion, despite Russian claims. The fundamental issue is that Russian imperial ideology, whether in Tsarist, Soviet, or modern form, cannot accept Ukrainian independence. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its natural sphere of influence, if not part of Russia itself. The idea that Ukrainians might choose their own path, particularly one oriented toward Europe rather than Russia, is intolerable to this worldview. From Ukraine's perspective, this is a struggle for survival as a nation. Every time Ukraine has tried to assert independence or pursue its own path, Russia has intervened. The pattern is consistent across centuries. Promises of partnership followed by domination, suppression of Ukrainian language and culture, violent repression of independence movements, and denial of Ukrainian identity itself. The current war is simply the latest chapter in this centuries-long struggle. Ukraine is fighting for the right to exist, to govern itself, to choose its own alliances, and to preserve its language, culture, and identity. These are rights that most nations take for granted, but Ukraine has had to fight for them repeatedly throughout its history. The conflict also represents a clash of values. Modern Ukraine, despite its imperfections, has embraced democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It seeks integration with European institutions based on these values. Russia, under Putin, has moved increasingly toward authoritarianism, rejecting democratic norms and seeking to maintain influence through force. Ukraine's success as a democratic, European-oriented state represents an existential threat to Putin's model of authoritarian government, because it shows Russians that an alternative is possible. International support for Ukraine reflects recognition that this is not just a regional conflict, but a test of fundamental principles of international order. If Russia succeeds in conquering Ukraine through military force, it would mean that borders can be redrawn by military might, that smaller nations exist only at the sufferance of powerful neighbors, and that the principles established after World War II no longer apply. The implications extend far beyond Ukraine to other countries facing pressure from powerful neighbors. The human cost of this centuries-long struggle has been staggering. Millions of Ukrainians have died in wars, famines, and repressions. Families have been destroyed. Cities have been reduced to rubble. Entire generations have grown up knowing nothing but conflict. The trauma runs deep in Ukrainian society, shaping national consciousness and identity. Yet Ukrainians have never given up. Despite centuries of oppression, despite overwhelming odds, despite the enormous power arrayed against them, Ukrainians continue to fight for their freedom. This resilience, this refusal to submit, is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ukrainian history. It is why Ukrainian national identity has survived despite systematic attempts to destroy it. It is why Ukraine exists as an independent nation today. The current war will eventually end, though no one can say when or how. But the underlying conflict between Ukraine's desire for independence and Russia's imperial ambitions will likely continue in some form. Russia's political elite, raised on narratives of empire and greatness, struggles to imagine Russia without Ukraine. Meanwhile, young Ukrainians who have grown up in an independent Ukraine, who have fought and died for their country, will never accept Russian domination. History teaches us that empires eventually fall, that people's desire for freedom and self-determination is ultimately irrepressible, and that nations are not defined by the powerful, but by the determination of ordinary people to preserve their identity and dignity. Ukraine's history is a testament to these truths. It is a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming power, of cultural survival despite systematic suppression, and of a nation's unwavering commitment to freedom. The struggle between Ukraine and Russia is ultimately about whether nations have the right to choose their own destiny or whether great powers can dictate the fate of their neighbors. It is about whether might makes right or whether principles like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination matter. These questions have relevance far beyond Eastern Europe. The answers will shape the world order for generations to come. Ukraine fights on, not because victory is certain, but because the alternative is unthinkable. To surrender would mean the end of Ukraine as a nation, the erasure of Ukrainian identity, and the vindication of the principle that powerful countries can dominate their neighbors by force. For Ukrainians, this is not an abstract geopolitical question. It is about survival, dignity, and the right to exist as a free people on their own land. The world watches and history will judge. But for Ukraine, there is no choice. They fight because they must, because their ancestors fought, because their children's future depends on it, and because freedom, once tasted, cannot be surrendered. This is why Ukraine has been fighting Russia for centuries. This is why they fight today. And this is why, no matter how long it takes, they will never stop fighting for their right to be free.